When Sara Wisnosky's body was pulled from the Lafayette River, the story stopped being theoretical. Up until that moment, everything existed in fragments: missed plans, late-night movements, uneasy impressions, and explanations that floated just long enough to avoid scrutiny. A young woman hadn't come home. A relationship had cooled and reignited. A night had passed without witnesses who thought they were watching anything important. That changes when a body is found, because death collapses ambiguity. It draws a hard line between what can be explained away and what must be accounted for. By the early evening of September 22nd, 1993, that line had been crossed. Sara was found nude in the water less than a mile from where she had last been seen alive. Not hidden deep in the wilderness, not miles away from where anyone might plausibly have lost track of her. She was found close, geographically, temporally, and relationally, to the space where her final hours unfolded. And once that happened, the question was no longer where did she go? It became what happened to her. In part one, we focused on Sara's world before violence entered it. Who she was, how she moved through campus life, how relationships formed quickly in that environment, and how, in the days leading up to her death, ordinary human decisions were shaped by trust, reconciliation, and familiarity. In part two, the lens narrows, because when investigators begin documenting what was left behind inside a bedroom, along a riverbank, and across a short span of hours, the story Derek Barnabei told could no longer exist on its own terms. Stories rely on cooperation. Evidence does not. This episode is not about speculation or motive. It's about collision, the moment where narrative meets physical reality, where explanations are forced to align with time, space, and material facts. It's about the difference between saying something happened and being able to support it when nothing is allowed to move, soften, or disappear. In the early 1990s, forensic science carried enormous weight. DNA was still enough to feel definitive, even when its limitations were poorly understood. Blood evidence was persuasive. Injury patterns were interpreted with confidence, and once physical findings began to stack up, they shaped the investigation's direction almost immediately. That process did not begin in a courtroom, it began at a scene, in a room that did not look lived in anymore, with objects that were out of place, with injuries that could not be explained away, with a timeline that narrowed instead of expanding. This is the point where momentum becomes dangerous or decisive, where early conclusions harden, where alternative explanations begin to disappear, and where the system starts moving towards resolution long before every question has been asked. In this episode, we're going to walk through what was observed, what was collected, and what those early findings suggested before trials, before appeals, before death penalty debates entered the conversation. Because regardless of where you land on Derek Barnabei's guilt, the evidence that surfaced in those first hours matters. It shaped everything that followed. This is where certainty began to take form, and once certainty sets in, the rest of the system tends to fall in line. And that's where we're going now. Hey, Angela, how's it going tonight?
Hi, John, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really good. Yeah. I feel like we're getting back into a routine, which feels
It does.
good.
Yeah,
you know,
it does feel good.
my life is resembling normal, I think. You know, I mean, I got some health issues coming, or I have some health issues that might affect things coming up, but we take it one day at a time and
Yep.
see what the world brings us, right?
Hopefully good things.
Well, we're hoping so, but welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue. If you're just joining us, this is part 2 of our series on the murder of Sara Wisnosky. In part 1, we stayed deliberately upstream. We focused on who Sara was, the world she was stepping into, and the sequence of decisions and interactions that placed her in proximity to danger without rushing ahead to conclusion. Tonight, that changes because by the end of September 22nd, 1993, Sara was no longer missing. She'd been found, and the investigation was no longer about uncertainty, it was about interpretation. Before we go any further, a quick note to our listeners and to our viewers. If you value this kind of slow, careful, evidence-driven storytelling, please take a moment to like, follow, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you're listening or watching. Those small actions genuinely help this work reach more people and keep these stories alive.
And if you're new here, welcome. Dark Dialogue isn't about shock value or quick answers. We take cases apart piece by piece so you can understand how investigations actually unfold, how narratives form, and how systems respond once violence enters the picture. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, we do recommend starting there. This episode builds directly on that foundation.
In this episode, we're moving into the aftermath. We'll talk about what was discovered, what was observed, and how early evidence began shaping the direction of the case almost immediately. Then we'll get into the theories, the courtroom arguments, and what was found, what was suggested. But this is the point where stories meet physical reality, where explanations stop floating, and where the system begins narrowing its focus.
It's also where perspective really matters. What something looks like in the moment, what responders notice first, and what gets documented early can influence everything that comes later. That's what we'll be unpacking tonight.
So settle in. This is part 2 of the murder of Sara Wisnosky.
Before we continue, we need to share an important content warning. This episode includes discussion of the violent death of a minor. We will be talking about acts of physical violence, sexual violence, and homicide. While we will approach these topics with care and purpose, some portions of this episode may be distressing or difficult to hear. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Please take care of yourself and step away at any point if you need to.
So when officers arrived on Mayflower Road on the evening of September 22nd, 1993, they were not responding to a missing persons report. They were responding to a body. This was a quiet residential street in Norfolk. Yards sloped gently towards the Lafayette River, short concrete staircases descending into what was less a river than a narrow tidal canal like we talked about.
Okay.
It was calm, shallow, residential in a way that made what waited there feel immediately out of place. So just after 6 o'clock, a woman walking her dog noticed something floating near the bank. And at first, she thought it was a mannequin. Well, it wasn't. She flagged down a nearby... What's up?
How is the first thought, maybe I'm morbid, how is the first thought it's a mannequin?
I think it's like I said in the last episode, I think the human mind is wired in a way to deny reality first. Like that is the most horrific thing. Like through emergency services, I've seen a lot of dead bodies. Luckily I've never come across a dead body when I wasn't prepared for it. Like when you're responding to the scene of a car wreck or an unresponsive person or something, you're prepared. Like you're on the way and you know you're about to see some shit that nobody should have to see.
Right.
When you're walking your dog, you are not prepared. And so I think your first instinct, and even with my experience, I'm not so sure that my first instinct wouldn't be, well, it can't be a body, but I wonder, it kind of looks like a mannequin. And then you're like, oh, no, holy shit, it really is a body.
I feel like my brain would be like, why would a mannequin be out here? I don't know, but I mean, you don't know until it happens to you.
Yeah, I don't think it's that unusual. It's not that unusual because case after case after case after case, especially when they're floating in water, comes up. I thought it was a mannequin. And some of that
it was a doll. I thought it was okay.
Some of that is what happens to the color of a human body after death. You lose the power that you normally have. So, you know,
and water does that too.
Well, the thing about water is it covers. So you know of what lividity is, when basically the blood in the body. Well, let's say you're floating face down. The water is hiding the lividity. Mm-hmm. And so what is poking out of the water is the area of the body where the blood is drained out of.
Right.
So it's very white colored. It doesn't look human. Okay. So I can understand especially in water, I can understand that being like
how it would
kind of looks like a body, but it doesn't, you know, it's not the right color, and it's not, and she was naked. And so you don't have clothing that you can So I can understand. I really can.
Okay. It just struck me as like, why would you assume it would be a mannequin in this particular place? Now in Wyoming, I would never, because mannequins are hard to come by.
Oh yeah. 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 If you find something in Wyoming, it's a body.
Yeah.
I would imagine that they find stuff floating in this river all the time.
Yeah, it's probably sadly true.
Yeah. But the woman flagged down a nearby patrol car and she directed the officers to the water line. And what they saw there would define the case from that moment forward. It was a young female body, completely nude, floating face down near the steps leading from a backyard into the Lafayette. The water at the bend was still, the body close enough to the shore to be reached without entering the river. One account would later describe her as blue and bloated, evidence of hours in the tidal water, but not days. Officers secured the area and they called for supervisors, detectives, and EMS. The scene was documented before the body was brought ashore and transported for examination. But even in those first minutes, it was already clear that this was not an accidental death. Not because of what had been concluded, but because of what was lying right there. And this is where I got to deviate and draw attention to the fact that I think I was wrong about the fact that he could have thrown her in the water at the end of his street. And the reason is because what was found on the shore near her body. He threw her in the water at this point.
Okay.
But on the concrete steps leading down to the water, officers found a single leather shoe. Nearby, a washcloth stained with blood. And on the body itself, a high school class ring engraved with initials that would soon provide a name. Within hours, the victim was identified as 17-year-old Sara Wisnosky, a freshman of Old Dominion University. That identification changed everything. What had begun as a river recovery became a homicide investigation with a known victim, a known last location, and physical evidence pointing away from the water and back towards the land. Specifically, back toward a house less than a mile away. At this stage, investigators were not building theories. They were following gravity, physical, geographical, and evidentiary. A body in the water, personal items on the steps, and a growing indication that whatever happened to Sara did not begin at the river. This riverside scene was not the crime itself. It was where the crime surfaced. And from here, the focus would shift away from the Lafayette and toward what happened before Sara ever reached the water. So in the first hours after Sara Wisnosky's body was recovered from the Lafayette River, detectives were not looking for a suspect. They were looking for a name. The high school ring found with her body provided the first foothold, SJW. It wasn't a clue that required interpretation. It was identification waiting to be confirmed. And once investigators connected the ring to 17-year-old Sara Wisnosky, the Old Dominion freshman living in Rogers Hall, the focus shifted immediately to a simple question. Where was she supposed to be? That question is where the investigation turned, not dramatically, not controversially, but cleanly and quickly. Detectives contacted Old Dominion University and they located Sara's roommate, Vicki Van Belkom. What Van Belkom told them mattered, and not because it was emotional or speculative, but because it was specific. She explained that on the evening of September 21st, Sara had called her, not to say that she was missing, not to say that she was in trouble, but to do what she routinely did when she stayed off campus. She called to say that she would not be coming back to the dorm that night, and she named exactly where she would be staying. Derek Barnabei's house on West 48th Street.
Or surf.
The call established something critical. Sara had a destination and it was known. And from there, detectives moved outward, not forward. They confirmed that Sara's clothing, belongings, and personal items were still in her dorm room. Nothing was packed. There was nothing removed. Nothing that suggested she intended to disappear. That eliminated a runaway narrative before it ever even formed. And next came confirmation. Detectives went to the West 48th Street rooming house and they began speaking with the people who lived there. Housemate Troy Meglamont confirmed that Sara had arrived at the house that night. Other occupants placed her not just in the house, but in Derek Barnabei's bedroom. And as far as anyone could say, that was where she'd last been seen alive. At this stage, no one was accusing anyone of murder. What police had was a straight line: a known victim, a last phone call, a confirmed destination, a confirmed room. That is how investigations narrow, not through suspicion, but through verification. And on September 23rd, the day after Sara's body was recovered, officers returned to the house to conduct more formal interviews. And based on what they now knew, that Sara had been in Derek's room and was dead within hours, they sought and obtained a search warrant. Not for the house, but for Derek Barnabei's bedroom. When detectives entered that room, it did not look like a space someone had simply slept in and left. They described it as abandoned, the bed stripped bare, bloodstains where blood did not belong, a window open, its screen removed, not for air, but for access. What investigators saw inside that room did not answer every question, but it answered the most important one. Sara Wisnosky did not die in the river, and whatever happened to her did not begin on Mayflower Road. It began right here. From this point forward, the case would no longer be about where Sara was found. It would be about what happened inside a single room on West 48th Street and how the physical evidence inside it spoke louder than anything anyone would later say. So from this point forward, I am not going to pretend any kind of neutrality, as if I've done a good job of that anyway, but I'm not going to pretend neutrality where none exists. There is a difference between presuming guilt and recognizing when innocence collapses under the weight of evidence. And what police found inside Derek Barnabei's living space was not ambiguous. It was not circumstantial fog. It was not compatible with any innocent explanation. On September 23rd, the day after her body was pulled from the Lafayette River, detectives executed a search warrant on his bedroom at the West 48th Street house. And what they walked into was not a bedroom in use. They described it as abandoned, not messy, not lived in, abandoned. The bed was stripped completely bare, no sheets, no linens, no explanation for where they went, and they were never recovered. The waterbed frame and headboard were stained with blood. That blood would later be identified as Sara's. One wall showed blood spatter consistent with violent impact. When detectives pulled back the carpet, they found what cleaning could not erase: a damp red stain soaked into the padding under the carpet. Human blood that had been deliberately concealed by surface cleaning. And that detail matters because accidental blood does not get hidden under carpet padding. Someone tried to erase what happened there, and they failed. The bedroom window was open. The screen had been removed, not cracked, not damaged, removed. The window didn't face the street. It faced the rear of the property, toward yards, fences, and quiet access to the trunk of a car. Inside the room, police also recovered a handwritten note among Surf's belongings.
Sorry.
It read, quote, "Women just don't get it," end quote. That was not evidence of murder on its own, but it was evidence of mindset, found in a room already soaked in violence. There was the shoe. And if you remember, his roommate, his housemate, left the house and saw the shoe laying on the ground right by Surf's car.
Yeah.
And threw it up on the porch. And then it ended up in the house. And then
it walked there.
But then remember, at the riverbank on Mayflower Road where the body was recovered, police had recovered another single leather shoe, and inside the bedroom, they found its match. So Obviously, I'm not drawing out the suspicion. They're her shoes. One was found with the body. One was found in douchebag's bedroom, and blood was present. That alone connected the room to the body, but the trail didn't stop there. Police followed the movement of bloodstain out of the bedroom. In another room of the house, they found Surf's surfboard. Surf had asked a fraternity pledge to store for him, and it had bloodstains on it. Outside the house, sitting on top of a trash can, officers found a pair of white socks. Forensic testing showed those socks contained Sarah's pubic hairs. Not fibers, not transfer from shared laundry, direct biological linkage that had been discarded. Behind the neighboring house, police recovered a towel with dark red stains that were consistent with blood, suggesting that bloody items had been carried or thrown beyond the immediate yard. What the scene shows clearly, repeatedly, and without room for creative interpretation is movement. From bed to floor to window to yard to river. And at every stage, evidence was left behind. This is not what innocence looks like. An innocent man does not strip a bed and lose the sheets forever. He does not conceal blood under carpet. He does not remove window screens in the middle of the night. He does not scatter bloodied items across rooms, trash cans, and neighboring yards. And he does not end the night with a dead girl in a river less than a mile away. Derek Barnabei's room was not merely associated with violence, it was saturated with it. By the time detectives finished documenting the space, the question was no longer if a crime had occurred there. The only remaining question was how much of the truth Derek had already tried and failed to carry away with him. And next, we're going to look at what the science revealed once the body, the room, and the injuries were finally examined together, because whatever story Surf tried to sell later, the evidence never bought it. Now, before we continue, I gotta stop and say again, this next segment contains explicit medical findings from the autopsy of Sara Wisnosky. These details involve extreme violence against a minor and may be difficult or distressing to hear. If you need to step away, now is the time. You can skip ahead approximately 3 or 4 minutes to avoid the forensic discussion, and you can rejoin us afterward. For those who choose to continue, understand this. These details are not included for shock. They are included because they explain what happened, how it happened, and why the evidence could no longer be ignored. When the autopsy was performed, the narrative shifted permanently. Up until this point, investigators had a violent scene, a trail of evidence, and a suspect whose story did not hold together. What they needed next was certainty, and they got it. The state deputy medical examiner documented at least 10 severe blows to Sara Wisnosky's head. Not glancing strikes, not superficial injuries. At least 10 forceful impacts concentrated on the back and right side of her skull, fracturing the bone. The examiner testified that the injuries were consistent with a heavy, blunt object, specifically something like a ball-peen hammer. This was not a single loss of control. It was repeated, deliberate violence. Sara had also sustained significant bruising to her abdomen. The examiner testified that these injuries could have been caused either by a direct blow or by the assailant kneeling on her body to hold her in place. And that detail matters because it speaks to control, to restraint, to a victim being overpowered while still alive. The injuries did not stop there. The autopsy documented bruising on Sara's neck and larynx, along with petechiae on her face. Tiny hemorrhages that in forensic medicine are a classic indicator of mechanical asphyxiation. The examiner was clear in his testimony. These findings were consistent with manual strangulation. Hands, pressure, sustained force applied to the neck. In addition to the head trauma and the asphyxia, the examiner documented bruising to the vaginal opening and a half-inch tear to the anal opening. He testified that the bruising occurred before death and that the anal tear was inflicted very close to the time of death. The cause, in his professional opinion, was forcible stretching. The testimony left no room for ambiguity. This was not accidental injury. It was inflicted. The medical examiner further testified that drowning was not the cause of death. While a small amount of fluid was found in Sarah's lungs, it was not sufficient to establish drowning as the fatal mechanism. However, and this point is critical, he could not rule out the possibility that Sarah was still alive when her body was placed in the water. What he could say definitively was this: the primary cause of death was catastrophic head trauma. Mechanical asphyxia or strangulation was a contributing factor. Taken together, the autopsy told a single unified story. Sara Wisnosky was beaten, she was restrained, she was strangled, she was sexually assaulted, and she was placed into the river afterward. This was not a sudden accident, and it was not panic. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a sustained assault that unfolded over time with multiple mechanisms of injury inflicted while Sarah was alive. And once those findings were placed next to the blood-soaked bedroom, the missing bedding, the removed window screen, and the trail to the river, there was no version of events left where this could be anything other than intentional, personal, and lethal violence. In the next segment, we're going to talk about how these findings intersected with the physical evidence inside douchebag's room and how prosecutors would later use this medical testimony to dismantle every claim of innocence that he tried to make. Because once the body speaks, no story can drown it out. Now, there's one more part of Sara Wisnosky's story that needs to be addressed, and not because it raises suspicion, but because it raises questions that many listeners will quietly carry if we don't just talk about it. So, this part of the story belongs to her family. But according to the records from the Spring Hill Cemetery office, Sara Wisnosky was buried on September 24th, 1993, just 2 days after her body was discovered in the Lafayette River. And that timeline is fast, unusually fast.
It's a lot of fast.
In most homicide cases, burial is delayed to allow for extended forensic review, legal documentation, and investigative coordination. But speed alone does not indicate anything improper. It just indicates urgency. It indicates grief. It indicates parents trying to regain some control in the aftermath of something that shattered their world. And then 10 years later, something else occurred that is also very uncommon, but it was documented. On July 21st, 2003, Sarah's remains were disinterred with a permit authorizing cremation. And that authorization for that decision was granted by her mother, Patricia Streeter, who at the time lived in Bel Air, Maryland. That information is not inferred. It is not rumor. It is recorded, and it deserves to be handled with care. Disinterment and cremation a decade after burial is rare, but it is not unheard of. Families move, circumstances change, needs change. Sometimes it's about proximity, wanting a loved one closer to you. Sometimes it's about cost. Sometimes it's about health. Sometimes it's simply about time passing and grief shifting shape. There is no public record explaining why Sarah's mother made that decision, and there does not need to be. Because this was not an investigative act. It was a familial one. What matters here is not the speculation that we could invent, but the restraint that we must exercise. Sarah's parents lost their daughter in one of the most violent ways imaginable. Everything that followed, the burial, the later cremation, it belongs to their private grief, not to public interpretation. So we acknowledge it. We don't sensationalize it. We don't attach meaning where there is none documented. And we don't turn a family's decisions into a subplot. What we do instead is recognize something simple and human. After the violence ended, after the evidence was cataloged, after the case moved forward, Sarah's family was left to carry the weight of what remained. And how they chose to do that is not a mystery to solve. It's a boundary to respect. So from here, Our focus returns to the system that claimed to deliver justice and the evidence that they relied on to do it. Sarah's story does not belong to speculation. It belongs to truth. So after the search of Asshat's room on September 23rd, the case accelerated fast, but the record does something strange. It goes quiet. Not silent, just thin. There is no clean hour-by-hour account of when douchebag left Norfolk. There is no neatly stamped departure date. And depending on who is telling the story, prosecution, defense, or later summaries, the timing shifts by hours or days. What doesn't shift is the outcome. He was gone. Here's what we can anchor with confidence. Sara Wisnosky's body was discovered around 6 o'clock in the evening of September 22nd. The next day, the 23rd, police were inside the West 48th Street house. They spoke with the occupants, they secured a warrant, and when they opened the door to douchebag's room, they were no longer dealing with a missing persons case. They were looking at a homicide scene. Blood where it shouldn't be, a stripped bed, an open window with the screen removed, personal items linking the room directly to the riverbank where Sara had been found. And from that moment forward, Surf, Derek, douchebag, asshat, whatever you want to call him, was no longer just a person of interest. He was the person. And somewhere in that same narrow window, either late on the 22nd or shortly after the search on the 23rd or sometime in there, he left Norfolk. That much every source agrees on. What they don't agree on is exactly when. Some prosecution-aligned summaries state that he fled the area before Sara's body was even discovered, leaving in the hours immediately following the killing. Other accounts, including defense-side narratives, suggest that he left after learning that police were looking for him. After calls were made, questions were asked, and the walls started to close in. Those differences matter legally, but they don't matter to the narrative. They point in the same direction. Because whether he left before the body was found or after his room was searched, the through line is the same. He did not stay. He did not contact police. He did not return, and he did not make himself available to answer questions. Instead, Asshat disappeared from Virginia and resurfaced months later under an assumed name living in Ohio. That disappearance is not a footnote. It is the hinge between suspicion and pursuit. Once Norfolk detectives confirmed that he was gone, and once they understood the scale of what had happened inside that bedroom, the case shifted from a local investigation to a fugitive search. Warrants were obtained, his information was entered into law enforcement systems, and the working assumption became clear. They were no longer looking for Derek Barnabei. They were looking after him. What's missing in the record is just as telling as what's present. There was no documentation of Derek speaking with police during this window, no voluntary interview, no attempt to clear things up, no explanation offered in real time. From the moment he left that house, the next fixed point in the story doesn't arrive until December 19th, 93, when he was arrested in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, living under a false identity. That 4-month gap isn't filled with answers, it's filled with absence. And absence in a case like this speaks very loudly. By the end of September, Derek Barnabei was no longer a college town figure trying to manage a story. He was a man on the run. And from here forward, the case stops being about what people said and becomes about what the evidence forced them to confront. One of the hardest things to pin down in this case is when each lie was discovered. And that's not a failure of research. It's the nature of the deception. Derek Barnabei didn't tell one big lie that collapsed all at once. He lived inside a layered fiction, one that unraveled gradually as investigators, prosecutors, and witnesses began comparing notes. Some of these falsehoods were uncovered in the frantic days after Sara's murder. Others surfaced during the manhunt. Still more were exposed in court under oath years later. But the timing matters less than the pattern, because Across every phase of this case, before the murder, after the murder, during the investigation, at the trial, Derek Barnabei was lying about who he was. Not accidentally, not defensively, deliberately. At Old Dominion, he wasn't Derek Rocco Barnabei at all. He was Serafino, or Surf, a curated identity designed to sound worldly and impressive and just a little bit dangerous. He told students that he was a Rutgers graduate, that he was educated, accomplished, already through college. That wasn't true. He told people he was a full member of Tau Kappa Epsilon. Not just affiliated, not just around, an actual brother. That wasn't true either. What investigators later established was far simpler and far less impressive. He had once been a pledge at a different school in New Jersey and never became a member. At ODU, he had no legitimate standing at all. And yet, using that invented status, he embedded himself into the fraternity life, aggressively recruited pledges, and positioned himself as someone with influence, a quote, rush machine. All of it built on false credentials. And then there were the lies about sex. In public, he bragged, he performed, he exaggerated his sexual success to establish dominance in front of the other men. But the moment that image was threatened, when Sarah's casual remarks surfaced, he pivoted instantly. Suddenly, they had never even had intercourse. Suddenly, it was only oral sex. Not because the truth changed, but because the audience did. After the murder, the lies shifted again. When questioned about the smell in his car, he said it was dirty laundry. When asked why he wasn't in his room, it was, quote, a long effed up story. When explaining his departure, he said he was just going to work with his dad for a couple of days. And then he disappeared, out of state, under an alias, for months. That isn't confusion, that's concealment. And layered into all of this, exposed later at trial, was a history he never disclosed to the people around him. A prior marriage, an ex-wife who testified to a sustained pattern of verbal abuse, physical violence, sexual assault, and explicit death threats. That history didn't fit the persona, so it stayed buried until it couldn't. By the time this case reached a courtroom, prosecutors weren't dealing with isolated inconsistencies. They were dealing with a man who had spent years inflating, minimizing, denying, and reinventing himself depending on what served him best in that particular moment. That's why they called him a predator, a charlatan, a windbag. Not as insults, but as descriptors, because he was all those things. Because when you strip away the aliases, the credentials, the fraternity status, the sexual bravado, and the excuses, what remains is someone whose public identity bore little resemblance to any verifiable facts. And that matters because when someone lies about everything else, their education, their status, their past, their movements, it becomes impossible to treat their claims of innocence as a single isolated truth. In this case, deception wasn't incidental, it was foundational. And as we move forward, the foundation is going to collide hard with physical evidence that doesn't give a shit who Derek Barnabei pretended to be. It only records what actually happened. So, just so we're clear with what I just went through, here's this freaking guy living in, and again, the fraternity did not own this house, but living in a frat house, going to college, all of this shit.
Quotes.
He didn't belong to the fraternity.
No.
He never went to college. He had no affiliation whatsoever with Old Dominion University. Never took a class there. It was all fake. All of it was made up bullshit. It's amazing to me that it's amazing how it all happened. It's amazing. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
And I worked my ass off trying to figure out what this piece of shit did all day And the fact of the matter is he lied. That's what he did all day. And he was living off of his housemates. He had no job. He didn't work. There is no work record for this piece of shit in Norfolk at all. He never worked. I was trying to figure out how he ate, I think he just mooched off everybody. That's all I could find.
As the cool guy.
As the rush machine.
Yeah.
And the guy was very manipulative. He was very good at it. And so I could see a son of a bitch like this being very, very good at getting pledges to the fraternity. So I'm sure it was like, oh yeah, well, he's kind of a pain in the ass and the guy's a real asshole, but he brings in a lot of pledges and, he's part of national or he's a fraternity brother. So we've got to treat him like that, and I don't know how shit goes now, and I don't know how shit was supposed to go then. I don't know if there's supposed to be some verification that you actually belong to the fraternity.
No.
Or if you just can walk in there and be like, hey, I'm a brother, and Tau Kepa Dubada, and this and that and the other shit, and whatever it all means. I don't know. But I don't know how that shit works.
I'm sure there is a fraternity named that.
Probably. But anyway, by December of 93, Derek Barnabei had done something that on its face looks impossible. He had vanished from Norfolk and then quietly reassembled a life somewhere else. For nearly 3 months after Sara was killed, Derek lived in Ohio under a false name while Norfolk police were treating him as a fugitive in a rape and murder investigation. The double reality only ended on December 19th, 93. That day, Derek was arrested in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, an Akron area suburb, after a routine traffic-related check exposed the New Jersey registration that was tied to his real identity. When the officer ran it, Derek didn't come back as a guy with paperwork issues. He came back as a wanted man in connection with a homicide in Virginia. Up to that moment, the performance had held. In Ohio, Derek had done what he'd always done. He blended in. He lied his ass off, I'm sure. He found work, steady work, at a restaurant, eventually serving as a floor manager.
He worked?
Yeah, apparently. Couldn't find anybody to mooch off of, I guess. I don't know. According to later testimony, he worked every day. He showed up, he functioned, he passed. He also started another relationship. Her name was Carla DeSantis. She was 23 years old. They met in the fall of 93 and moved in together in December, just days before his arrest. Can you imagine what that poor girl went through?
Exactly.
To her, Derek was attentive, affectionate, gentle. He was in that whole courting phase when they're really nice before they start beating the piss out of you and raping you and throwing you in rivers.
Unfortunately, yes.
She would later describe him as very sweet, very tender, always loving. She says she never saw him act aggressively, never saw violence, never saw rage. What she did see was another version of the same story. He told her that he came from a, quote, mafia-like family in New Jersey. He said a family dispute had forced him to leave home. He gave her a narrative that explained his isolation without ever mentioning Sara Wisnosky, Norfolk, or the fact that police were looking for him for murder. It was the same formula, a new city, a new audience, but the same fabricated biography. And for a time it worked. When Derek was arrested, he was taken into custody without bail and held for extradition. 2 armed detectives transported his sorry ass back to Virginia to face charges for Sara's rape and murder. And when they arrived in Norfolk, reporters were waiting. Surrounded by cameras, Derek was asked directly if he killed Sara Wisnosky. His answer was immediate and well-practiced. Quote, "No, I did not. I stand on the firm foundation of a consciousness of innocence. I know ultimately the truth will come out. I am truly innocent." End quote.
Really?
Yeah, you tell me a lawyer didn't write that shit.
No shit.
That declaration would become a fixture of everything that followed. From jail, Derek began writing letters, claiming investigators had pressured him to confess, accusing homicide detective Sean Squires of threatening him with capital charges if he didn't cooperate. Those allegations would be raised again later, folded into appeals and clemency arguments, but at this stage, what mattered was simpler. The man who had fled, the man who had lied, the man who had reinvented himself yet again, he was back. And now, for the first time since September, the story was no longer his to control, because what waited for him in Virginia was not a narrative battle. It was evidence, and that evidence was already sitting in a bedroom on West 48th Street, waiting for a courtroom. So in the months after Sara was killed, the case against Douchebag didn't move forward all at once. It moved in layers, as court cases do.
Yeah.
And that matters because one of the arguments that would later be raised in Derek's defense was that the charges against him were, quote, changed, that prosecutors somehow escalated the case after the fact. Now, what actually happened is far more procedural and way, way, way less sinister. So, in April of '94, Asshat appeared in Norfolk Juvenile and Domestic Relations District Court for a preliminary hearing. Judge Charles Poston presided. And at that point, what?
Juvenile?
Yeah, it's just the name of the court. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know why he was in that court, but yeah, it's just...
That strikes me odd. Okay, continue.
It did me too, but I got nothing on that. But at this point, the charge on the table was first-degree murder. Not capital murder, not rape and murder, first-degree murder only. And that wasn't because investigators didn't suspect sexual violence, and it wasn't because the forensic work, or it was because the forensic work simply wasn't finished yet. At the preliminary hearing, a forensic technician testified about blood found in Derek's room, on the walls, around the bed, and beneath the carpet. The key phrase there was human blood. At that stage, it had yet to be typed. It had yet to be conclusively linked to Sara through laboratory analysis, and critically, no rape evidence was presented at all during that hearing. This wasn't a judgment call. It was a timing issue. Preliminary hearings are not trials. They're threshold checks. They're designed to answer one narrow question. Is there probable cause to believe that this person committed this crime? And Judge Poston ruled that there was. Based on the human blood, the last seen alive evidence, and the connection between Asshat's room and the river scene, the judge found probable cause for first-degree murder and certified the case to a grand jury. Then, the investigation didn't just stop. It kept going. So between April and September of 1994, the Commonwealth completed and organized the sexual assault evidence. That included the medical examiner findings that documented the vaginal and the anal trauma, the laboratory work involving semen and the pubic hair evidence, and the clear forensic picture of what happened before Sara was killed. So once that work was ready to be presented formally, the legal posture of the case changed. So on September 7th of '94, a Norfolk grand jury returned a new indictment. And this time, Douchebag was charged with capital murder, specifically murder committed in the course of rape, and rape as a separate count. This shift wasn't about strategy, it was about sufficiency. Virginia law is very specific. A homicide becomes a capital offense only when certain qualifying factors, like rape, are legally established. In April, that threshold hadn't been met yet, but by September, it had. So the case evolved the way criminal cases usually do. Not all at once, but as evidence matures. And from that point forward, Asshat was no longer facing a life sentence charge. He was facing the death penalty. That's where the legal stakes changed permanently, and it's where the courtroom phase of the story truly begins. So by the time this total piece of shit went to trial in the spring of 1995, the case against him had hardened. This was no longer about suspicion or about proximity. It was about reconstruction. The trial was held in Norfolk Circuit Court in May and June of 1995 before Judge William Rutherford. The charges were capital murder, killing in the commission of rape, and rape itself. And from the Commonwealth's perspective, the case was built on three pillars: forensic science, physical linkage, and time. Now, there was no eyewitnesses who saw Derek strike Sara, and there was no confession. Instead, the jury was asked to look at what remained after the violence stopped. They heard from housemates who described the night in fragments: the music that wouldn't get turned down, the locked door, the frantic effort to move a car in the early morning hours, the strange, vacant behavior afterward. They heard from the medical examiner who described a beating that involved repeated, forceful blows to the head, signs of strangulation, and sexual injuries that, according to his testimony, were not consistent with any kind of ordinary consensual sex. They heard from forensic experts who tied blood in Derek's room directly to Sara, on the bed frame, the wall, the carpet beneath the carpet. They heard about the shoe at the riverbank and its match in his room, the socks in the trash with Sara's pubic hairs, the blood-stained surfboard moved out of the room, the note left behind, quote, "Women just don't get it." And they heard about Derek's behavior before and after, the humiliation at the fraternity gathering, the anger, the contradictions, the flight from Norfolk, the assumed name in Ohio. The defense, by contrast, presented very little during the guilt phase. Derek did not testify. Only two defense witnesses appeared, and neither offered an alternate account of what happened in that room. Instead, defense counsel focused on absence. There's no eyewitness, uncollected prints, unexamined items, and the argument that whatever sex occurred could have been consensual. After deliberation, the jury rejected that framing, and on July 14th, 1995, they convicted Derek the asshat Barnabei of both rape and capital murder. And the next day, they recommended death. Now, what's important and often misunderstood is what happened after the verdict, because Derek didn't stop fighting the case and courts didn't rubber stamp everything. On appeal in the habeas proceedings, Derek raised dozens of issues. Many were dismissed outright. Some were waived, but a handful were taken seriously and reviewed closely. And one of the most important was this: rape had to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. On that point, later courts actually agreed with the premise. They acknowledged explicitly that if the rape finding failed, the capital murder conviction could not stand. They did not treat rape as a technicality. They analyzed the evidence carefully. Where the courts disagreed with Derek was on the conclusion. Looking at the injuries, the violent context, the DNA evidence, and the surrounding behavior, appellate courts held that any rational jury could find beyond a reasonable doubt that the intercourse was non-consensual. In other words, they agreed with the legal standard, but not with Derek's claim that the standard wasn't met. They basically said, yes, you have to prove rape, and yes, they did prove rape. So, ipso facto, die, bastard. The same pattern played out elsewhere. Courts acknowledged that not every piece of evidence had been tested. They acknowledged that the investigation wasn't perfect. They acknowledged that defense counsel could have done more in some areas, but again and again, they returned the same question: would any of this have changed the outcome? And their answer was no. Not because the system is infallible, but because the remaining evidence was overwhelming. Later DNA testing ordered near the end of the appeals process did not weaken the case, it reinforced it. So while Derek won acknowledgement on narrow legal principles, how rape must be proven, how aggravators must be constrained, he did not win relief. Every reviewing court reached the same bottom line. The conviction stood, the sentence stood, and no constitutional error justified overturning either. So what matters is this: This was not a case where courts ignored defense arguments. It was a case where they examined them, and they still concluded that the evidence held. And that distinction matters because it tells us where the real fault lines are in this story. So by the fall of 1996, Derek Barnabei's case had already survived its first major test. On September 13, 96, the Supreme Court of Virginia issued its ruling in Barnabei versus Commonwealth, and the court affirmed everything: the rape conviction, the capital murder conviction, and the death sentence. They rejected challenges to the sufficiency of the evidence. They upheld the admission of prior violence testimony from his ex-wife and a former girlfriend. They reaffirmed the constitutionality of Virginia's death penalty framework, including the, quote, vileness aggravator as applied to Sara's killing. The court's message was unambiguous. A rational jury could have reached this verdict, and nothing at trial required reversal. For Derek, that closed the state court door. Federal court was next. In June of 2000, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th District denied his federal habeas petition in Barnabei versus Engellown. The court addressed the heart of his remaining arguments: ineffective assistance of counsel, untested evidence, and alleged investigative flaws. Again, the judges acknowledged the issues in theory. They acknowledged that some items were never tested. They acknowledged that defense counsel could have pursued different strategies. But they returned, yet again, to the same conclusion. Even if mistakes were made, Derek could not show prejudice. The evidence at trial, they said, was overwhelming. With that ruling, judicial review was essentially exhausted. So what came next did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in the final weeks before an execution date. So in late August of 2000, Derek's attorneys submitted a clemency request to Governor Jim Gilmore. At its center was a question that had lingered for years: the fingernail clippings. If Sara had scratched her attacker, those clippings might contain DNA from someone else. So on August 29, 2000, when court staff went to retrieve the fingernail evidence for testing, they reported that it was missing. For a brief moment, everything stopped. A capital case with an execution date, key biological evidence unaccounted for, and a question no one wanted to answer publicly. How does evidence disappear this late in the process?
No shit.
So Governor Gilmore ordered the Virginia State Police to investigate. The disappearance sparked international concern, protests, and renewed scrutiny of the case. Then, 2 days later, the evidence was found. It was not destroyed, it was not altered, but misplaced within the clerk's office outside the designated secure area. When the envelopes were examined, forensic officials reported that they were sealed, intact, and bore the original examiner's initials. There was no sign that they'd been opened or tampered with. Gilmore authorized DNA testing to proceed, and on September 11, 2000, the results came back. The fingernail clippings contained Sara's DNA and the DNA of one other person. That profile was compared against the Commonwealth's data bank. It matched one individual: Derek Asshat Rocco Barnabei.
Surf.
No third party, no unknown assailant, no exculpatory surprise. In his written decision, Governor Gilmore stated that new DNA testing did not undermine the verdict, it reinforced it. The missing evidence scar, the last best hope for intervention, ended not with a stay, but with confirmation. More freaking confirmation. How much do you people need? Clemency was denied. The execution moved forward. Now, what matters here is not just the outcome, but the process. This was not a case where late DNA testing was refused. It was ordered, it was completed, and it was used to make a final decision. And that decision did not save Asshat's life. And it closed one of the last unanswered forensic questions in Sara Wisnosky's case. So next we'll talk about what happens after that moment, how the case is remembered, debated, and relitigated in public memory long after the courts were finished, because for some cases, the legal ending is not the end of the story. In the final weeks before Derek Barnabei's execution, something unusual happened. This was no longer just a Virginia case. It became an international flashpoint. As the September 14, 2000 execution date approached, opposition to Barnabei's execution exploded far beyond the United States, driven not by new evidence of innocence, but by global resistance to the death penalty itself. The scale of the response was staggering. Amnesty International later documented that Governor Jim Gilmore received 364 appeals urging clemency from inside Virginia and 31 messages supporting the execution. From outside Virginia, the numbers told a very different story entirely. More than 13,000 appeals urging clemency poured in from abroad. Not a single pro-execution message came from outside the state. Formal appeals arrived from the European Union, from senior officials across Europe, and from the Vatican itself. Pope John Paul II personally urged Virginia to halt the execution, adding his voice to those arguing that capital punishment was morally wrong, regardless of guilt. Nowhere was the response more intense than Italy. Italian media covered the case relentlessly, emphasizing Barnabei's Italian-American heritage and framing the execution as a symbol of the widening divide between American capital punishment and European human rights norms. Italy's president, prime minister, justice minister, and leaders of every major political party appealed for clemency. Italian lawmakers traveled to Richmond to plead directly with Governor Gilmore. The Tuscan region, where Barnabei's grandfather had immigrated from, offered to fund additional DNA testing, even as new tests were already underway in Virginia. Public demonstrations followed. A protest tent was erected outside the Coliseum, where Italians lined up to send emails to the governor under banners reading, quote, "Let's save Barnabei." Rome's mayor ordered the Colosseum lit in gold, a symbolic protest against the death penalty. Vigils were held in Rome, Palmero, and other cities. Crowds gathered outside the Pantheon. Some Italian athletes even threatened symbolic protests at the Sydney Olympic opening ceremonies if the execution went forward. Italian state television aired Dead Man Walking in the days leading up to September the 14th, and on the night of the execution, broadcast live coverage of vigils from across Italy and from outside the Virginia prison itself. European officials were blunt. The Speaker of the European Parliament called the execution, quote, "sad and revolting," condemning what he described as the macabre scenario of carrying out a death sentence. The European Union lodged formal diplomatic objections. This wasn't subtle pressure. It was sustained, visible, and deeply political. Inside the United States, the reaction was more muted. A few dozen death penalty opponents held a candlelit vigil outside Greenville Correctional Center. The U.S. State Department quietly issued a security advisory warning Americans in Italy to be cautious amid heightened tensions. And Governor Gilmore responded directly to the criticism. In denying clemency on September 11th, he acknowledged that, quote, "many in this country and foreign countries," end quote, were mounting what he called a generalized assault on capital punishment. But he rejected it. Virginia, he said, had the right to set its own moral standard. And that standard was that violent murder would not be tolerated. What matters here is this distinction. The international outcry was not driven by a collapse of the case against Derek Barnabei. By that point, the courts had ruled. The DNA testing had been completed. The fingernail evidence was examined. The protests were about the death penalty itself, about whether the state should execute anyone, even after guilt had been affirmed again and again. But on the night of September 14, 2000, Virginia proceeded. Despite the Vatican, despite the European Union, despite the Colosseum glowing gold, Derek Barnabei was executed. And with that, the legal case ended. But the argument over what justice meant for Sara Wisnosky's death did not. That debate would continue long after the lights outside Greenville went dark. Derek Barnabei's final day unfolded inside a tightly controlled system, one built on routine, protocol, and repetition, where every movement, visit, and minute was logged. On that day, Derek spent his last hours on death row at Greenville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. That morning and early afternoon were given over to the final visits. He met with his spiritual advisor, the Reverend Bob West, for roughly 90 minutes. West later said Derek appeared calm, at peace, and, quote, ready to die, describing him as being in great spirits despite what lay ahead. Later, Derek received a final visit from his family, his mother Jane and his brother Craig. They left the prison before the execution as required by policy. During those final conversations, Derek tried to reassure his mother while acknowledging his fear, telling her, quote, Mom, I can deal with it, but I'm a little afraid. He urged his family to go on with their lives and encouraged them to keep fighting, expressing hope that people would continue to look closely at his case. His attorney, Seth Tucker, remained with him throughout the day. Derek spent much of the afternoon on the phone with his mother, and about 2 hours before his execution, he wrote out a handwritten will. He had initially asked to be cremated, but at his mother's urging, agreed instead to burial, with arrangements made for his body to be sent to Summers Point, New Jersey. At 5:06 p.m., Derek was served his last meal. At his request, prison officials did not disclose what it was.
Why am I finding myself pissed off about that?
I know, me too.
Okay.
So, as evening approached, the prison moved into its final execution protocol. Derek was the 79th person executed in Virginia since the state resumed capital punishment in the modern era. At 8:54 p.m., he was escorted into the execution chamber. He wore a blue shirt, dungarees, white socks, and blue shower slippers. In the witness room were corrections officials, clergy, media representatives, and his attorney. No member of Sara Wisnosky's family was present. As Derek entered the chamber, witnesses reported that he stared directly at Corrections Director Ron Angelone, who stood near a red telephone linked to Governor Jim Gilmore's office in the event of a last-minute intervention. There would be none. Inside the chamber, Father Jim Gallagher, a Roman Catholic priest, spoke briefly with Derek and then moved to the witness area where he whispered prayers as the procedure began. At Derek's earlier request, his Jewish attorney, Seth Tucker, quietly recited the Shema, a central Jewish prayer from the witness room. When asked for final words, Derek said, quote, I am truly innocent of this crime. Eventually, the truth will come out. He then expressed love for his mother and brother and thanked those who had supported him. At 9:02 p.m., the lethal injection chemicals began to flow. As the drugs took effect, Derek recited from Psalm 55:18, quote, He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for many were with me. End quote. Witnesses said that his lips continued moving in prayer for a short time before he became unresponsive. At 9:05 p.m., Derek Barnabei was pronounced dead. Outside Greenville, roughly 24 death penalty opponents held a candlelight vigil. Over 50 journalists, many from Italy, were present at the prison. And across the Atlantic in Rome, the Colosseum glowed gold, illuminated in protest as the execution proceeded in Virginia. And with that, the state closed the case. But for Sara Wisnosky's family and for those still debating what justice meant in her death, the story did not end when the lights went out in the execution chamber. When an execution ends a case, it does not always end the questions. In some cases, new evidence emerges later. DNA advances, recantations, undisclosed files that force a reckoning with what the courts got wrong. That did not happen here. In the years since the douchebag was executed, nothing has surfaced that meaningfully undermines the conviction. If anything, the final wave of testing and review reinforced the case against him. In the months leading up to his execution in 2000, his defense team pressed aggressively for this DNA testing of biological evidence that had never been examined, most notably the fingernail clippings, and that argument was straightforward. She fought her attacker, she may have scratched him, and DNA could be under her fingernails that could identify somebody else. Then, just days before the scheduled execution, those fingernail clippings were reported missing. And then they were discovered. And then they were tested. And the fingernail clippings contained DNA from the two people, Sara Wisnosky and Derek Barnabei. There was no unknown profile. There was no third party, no alternative suspects. Gilmore publicly stated the result confirmed Barnabei's guilt, describing the absence of any other DNA under her fingernails as a direct contradiction of the defense's last remaining theory. He declined to intervene. And since then, the case has been revisited time after time after time by journalists, scholars, human rights groups, and death penalty critics. Those reviews have raised broader concerns about capital punishment, about untested evidence in general, about whether the system allows enough margin for doubt, but they do not present new facts that exculpate Derek Barnabei. No court has overturned the conviction. No prosecutor's office has reopened the case. No innocence organization lists him as a wrongful conviction. No new witnesses have emerged. No alternative perpetrator has been identified. And the core evidentiary picture remains unchanged. Derek's semen was found in Sara's body with extremely high statistical certainty. Sara's blood was found throughout his bedroom, on the waterbed frame, the headboard, the wall, and soaked beneath the carpet. Her blood was found on a surfboard that he moved into another room. Her pubic hairs were found on socks discarded outside. One of her shoes was found at the Lafayette River steps, and the matching shoe was found in his room. She was last seen alive in his bedroom, and he fled the state under an alias within hours. That record has never been rebutted. So when Derek said in his final words, "I am truly innocent of this crime, eventually the truth will come out." Well, the truth did come out. It just didn't say what he wanted it to say. And that leaves us, finally, not with Derek Barnabei, but with Sara Wisnosky, the person whose life ended in that room, whose death set all of this in motion, and whose name should never be overshadowed by the man who killed her. Now, I want to slow things down for a moment because I think before we close this case, I need to be honest about something. I don't go to church anymore, but I grew up Catholic, and I still carry an enormous amount of respect for Pope John Paul II. His moral clarity, his insistence on the dignity of human life, and his unwavering opposition to the death penalty. I also want to be clear about something else. I do not care what anyone's opinion of capital punishment is. There are serious, thoughtful, good faith arguments on both sides. People have the right to protest peacefully protest, not burn down buildings, not freaking into places, not plunder and loot, but protest. They have the right to lobby, to argue, to try to change the law. That's not weakness, that's democracy. And on this issue especially, discomfort is not a flaw. It's a sign that you're paying attention. The death penalty is difficult for me too, because there is one line that I cannot get past: the execution of a truly innocent person. Our system is supposed to be built on the principle that it is better to let the guilty go free than to punish even one innocent person. And the hard truth, the unavoidable truth, is that innocent people have been executed. Not hypothetically, not maybe, documented cases. Carlos de Luna in Texas, convicted on misidentification while another man repeatedly confessed. Reuben Cantu, where the eyewitnesses recanted and even the prosecutor later doubted the verdict. Larry Griffin, where investigators later found he likely wasn't the shooter at all. David Spence, executed while the man alleged to have ordered the murders was later acquitted. Gary Graham, sentenced to death on a single fleeting eyewitness view with no physical evidance. Cameron Todd Willingham, put to death on fire science that we now know was junk. Sedley Alley, executed without modern DNA testing, with courts later acknowledging an innocent man may have been killed. Brian Terrell, Richard Masterson. One is too many. I struggle deeply with reconciling that reality. Because once the state kills an innocent person, there is no appeal, no apology that fixes it, no, we'll do better next time. And that weight matters. And yet, if we are going to have the death penalty at all, if we are going to say there exists a category of crime so brutal and so deliberate, so destructive that it forfeits the right to live, it is hard to argue that anyone fits that category more clearly than Derek Barnabei. If you need to skip ahead, this is your warning because this requires emphasis. So the next part involves description of violence. Sara Wisnosky was beaten at least 10 times in the head with a heavy blunt object, likely a ball-peen hammer, fracturing her skull. She was manually strangled. She had bruising to her neck and her larynx, petechiae on her face, classic signs of mechanical asphyxia. She suffered abdominal injuries consistent with force. She had bruising to her vagina. She had a tear in her anus that caused by forcible stretching, inflicted very close to the time of death. The medical examiner testified that drowning was not the cause of death, though she may not have been dead when her body was put into the water. The primary cause of death was massive head trauma. Strangulation was a contributing factor. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of passion. This was not ambiguity. This was sustained, intimate, personal violence inflicted on a 17-year-old kid in her first year of college. And it was followed by lies, cleanup, disposal, flight, and alias, a performance of innocence that never matched the evidence. I could hold both of these truths at once, that the death penalty is dangerous precisely because innocent people have been killed, and that in this case, the evidence leaves no room for reasonable doubt. If we are going to talk about justice honestly, we cannot pretend either of those things away. And when you think about Pope John Paul II, about mercy, about human dignity, I don't hear a call for denial. I hear a call for seriousness, for restraint, for moral gravity. That same gravity belongs here, because this story is not about Derek Barnabei's execution. It is about Sara Wisnosky's life. And whatever anyone believes about capital punishment, nothing about this case supports the idea that an innocent man was punished. Sara was. And that truth deserves to stand without distortion, without apology, and without being drowned out by the man who took her life. Before we end this episode, I want to bring things back to where it belongs. Not to courtrooms, not to appeals, not to arguments about punishment. Back to Sara before she became evidence. She was a 17-year-old girl who had just started college. She was figuring out who she was in a world that still felt new. She was living in a dorm room that didn't yet feel permanent. Making friends, balancing freedom and responsibility, calling her roommate when plans change because that's what you do when you expect to be seen again. Sara was not reckless. She was not naive. She was not asking for anything except the chance to keep becoming. Violence is a way of shrinking a life down to its final moments. It turns people into timelines, into injuries, into exhibits. But that is not who Sara was. She was motion. She was anticipation. She was a future that hadn't finished unfolding yet. And when we talk about justice, real justice, it starts there, with the recognition that what was taken from her cannot be measured only in years or verdicts or sentences. It was taken in mornings she never got to wake up, in phone calls that never happened, in plans that were still changing, in a life that had just begun to open outward. This episode asked hard questions. It confronted uncomfortable realities, but none of that matters if we forget why we're here. Sara Wisnosky mattered. She mattered before the crime. She mattered outside the courtroom. She mattered beyond the headlines. So in the next segment, we're going to focus on her, not as a case, not as a victim in the abstract, but as a young woman whose life deserves to be remembered for what it was, not just for how it ended, because before everything else, before the arguments, before the outcomes, there was Sara, and that is who we carry forward. I want to slow things down for a moment. When we tell these stories, especially when they involve young lives, we're mindful of how we enter this space. This isn't about dramatizing loss or drawing attention to ourselves. It's about making room to remember someone as they were before their life was reduced to dates and evidence and outcome. As part of that intention, we're once again using the music from the J.J. Hawk Band, produced through Hawk Studios, and this song has become part of Sara's story here. Not because it explains what happened, but because it creates a place to sit with who she was. It felt right for her when I was picking it, and we've chosen to keep it with her. The song you're about to hear is Whispers of the Night. It carries a quiet sense of youth and uncertainty, the space between presence and absence, between being known and being gone. It doesn't tell you what to feel, it simply stays with you. As the music plays beneath this tribute, we invite you to listen gently, not just to the facts of the case, but to the life behind them, to a young woman who is still becoming herself, still imagining what came next. This is Whispers of the Night by the J.J. Hawk Band, and this is Sara Wisnosky. Sara Wisnosky existed in the in-between, between childhood and adulthood, between certainty and curiosity, between the person she had been and the one she was still shaping. She was at an age where life isn't loud yet, it's exploratory, where independence doesn't arrive all at once, but in small, meaningful steps, choosing when to stay out late, deciding who feels safe, learning which voices to trust, learning slowly how to listen to her own. Sara moved through that space the way most people do, without fear, without armor, and without imagining that ordinary moments could carry consequences this permanent. She was not reckless. She was not careless. She wasn't defined by risk. She was defined by openness, by the way young people still believe the world is mostly decent, by the way they assume tomorrow will arrive because it always has before. Sara had relationships that mattered to her, friendships that carried inside jokes, shared routines, and quiet understanding. She had people she checked in with, people who expected to hear from her again, people who noticed when she didn't come back. That expectation that she would be seen again is one of the most human things about her story. She lived forward. She made plans casually, the way teenagers do, because the future still feels long. She didn't document every moment. She didn't lock herself away. She didn't live as if danger was inevitable, and she shouldn't have had to. When we talk about victims like Sara, there's a tendency to focus on the moment that everything stopped, but a life is not defined by its ending. It's defined by its momentum. And Sara had momentum. She was learning what independence felt like when she wasn't supervised. She was discovering who she was away from home, away from familiarity, away from the version of herself that everyone already knew. She was allowed to be unfinished. What was taken from her wasn't just time, it was possibility. the chance to look back one day and see how far she'd come, the chance to outgrow mistakes, to rewrite plans, and to surprise herself. She never got the chance to become older than her photograph. And that matters, because when we remember Sara, we're not remembering a case. We're remembering a young woman who trusted the world at a point when trust still felt reasonable. She didn't get the benefit of hindsight. She didn't get the warning signs that only exist after something goes wrong. She lived as people are supposed to live, open, curious, and unafraid. That isn't a flaw. That is not a mistake. That is not something to correct. It is something to honor. Sara Wisnosky mattered because she lived, because she laughed, because she expected tomorrow. And as we close this case, we've talked about the arguments and the outcomes. But before the system spoke, before the courts decided, before the world debated punishment and protest, there was a young woman whose life was still unfolding. That is who she was. That is who we remember. May you rest in peace, Sara. So that's where we're going to have to leave this episode. So yeah, that's the case. That is this insane case in a nutshell. Mm-hmm. I don't understand. I do not understand the whole. I guess it's just simply we don't like the death penalty.
Yeah.
But picking this guy as the poster child for that is the wrong move. I mean, there are people that are put to death that I would be like, I don't know. I mean, they committed the crime, they're guilty, but, I don't know. Or there's the cases that I listed that were actually innocent people were put to death. But
it seems like they could have done some research and found one of those.
I agree, and like JP2, John Paul II, he was against the death penalty. So this was nothing new for him. This was not a specific case that John Paul II got involved with or spoke out. He was consistent. He was consistent for the sanctity of life when it came to abortion, when it came to the death penalty, when it came to everything. I mean, this is the man that visited the guy that shot him all the time in prison.
Yeah.
I mean, so for him, I get it. This was his life's work. This was his stance unequivocally.
Right.
So I would not expect anything different because that's just what he did. But for the other people, like, this is the asshat that
I know.
Because this guy and what he did, man, he is a total piece of shit. So with that said, before we go, we want to thank you for being here and for listening with care. This kind of work only exists because people are willing to sit with difficult stories and treat them with respect. So if you want to be involved directly, the Dark Dialogue Collective is our volunteer, boots on the ground program for research, outreach, and advocacy. This is not a donation tier. It's for people who want to actively participate. And you can learn more about that at darkdialogue.com.
You can also support victims and their stories through our Adopt a Victim program or explore our victim tribute blog posts and case write-ups, all available at darkdialogue.com.
For ongoing support of this show, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/darkdialoguepod. For one-time support, visit Ko-fi, that's ko.fi.com/darkdialogue. And for long-form writing, research notes, and case updates, follow us on Substack at darkdialoguecrime.substack.com.
If you have information, questions, or need to reach us directly, you can email info@darkdialogue.com.
And be sure to check out the other shows on the Dark Dialogue Network: Rocky Mountain Reckoning, Distilled, Unraveled Truths, Gallows and Gunfights, and Shadow Chat Sessions.
Wherever you're listening or watching, please like, follow, subscribe, leave us a review, and turn on notifications. Those small actions help these stories reach the people who need to hear them.
Until next time, take care of each other, keep listening, keep asking questions, and as always, keep the dialogue alive.